Welcome back. Amongst the 4 datasets that we discussed, we are going to start with the cases and deaths file that contains the cases and deaths for all European countries. Please take a note of the URL. I have also included the list of URLs and a sample file in the course files for you, but let's navigate to the URL first and have a look at the data. Okay, here we are on the URL where we are seeing the CSV data in raw format directly onto the web. Now let's talk about this data. So as you can see, we got a CSV comma separated file with the header, and also you've got the data there. As opposed to what I expected, this seems to contain non-European countries as well, but we'll have a look at the data once we load it and we can deal with that later. And it's got a country, country code, continent, population, and then an indicator to say whether we are talking about confirmed cases or deaths, and then the actual daily count. And then the date on which the data was collected. And data relates to rather than data being collected, and then the source of the data as well. So this is as we expected. So we now need to design a pipeline to ingest the data from the portal directly into our data lake on a daily basis. By now, you're familiar with this diagram. This is very similar to the diagram that we used for the copy activity in the last module. The differences are that we've replaced the Azure Blob Storage with the HTTP link service. Our source file is now a CSV file rather than the tsv.gz we had previously. And finally, the target file is also a TSV file as opposed to the TSV file we had. So effectively we need to build a copy activity that downloads the CSV file from the URL and copies that across to the data lake. We're not doing any of the mappings or any transformations here. So let's have a look at what we need to do. The source file already exists in the URL, so we've got nothing to do, and similarly, we've already created the sync container raw. The copy activity itself will be configured to create the folder ECDC and also the file, so we got nothing to do on the storage account. For data lake either. The only things we got to do are the data factory components. Amongst these, we've already created the link service as part of the last session, so we got the other 5 things to do. So let's switch over to the Azure portal and get started. Okay, here we are back in our data factory. So the first thing we want to do is the link service to the HTTP URL. So by now you must be familiar with how to navigate within the data factory. If you know, click on the Manage button and then click on Link Services and click New. And we want to find the HTTP link service, so search for HTTP and then click Continue. We want to name our link service, so let's call it ls_http_ec_europa_eu. So you can leave the integration runtime as default, but we need to give a base URL. To grab the base URL, let go to GitHub raw data URL and copy it. And then let's paste it to base URL text box. And the URL we need to paste is https://raw.github-usercontent.com. And then the rest will form part of the dataset. So the link service will access up to that point, and when we create the dataset will access up to that point and download the file for you. So this is the base URL we want to put into our link service. So let's do that, and you can leave the service certification as default and authentication type. Click anonymous because we got anonymous access to the URL. We don't need any usernames or passwords, and then test the connection before creating. So okay, that's successful, so click Create. So now the link service is created, so let's create the datasets. So let's create the source dataset first, which is our HTTP dataset. So if you come over to Datasets, click on the 3 dots, Create New Dataset. Again, look for HTTP here and click Continue, and now we want to choose the CSV file. Because ours is a delimited CSV file, and click Continue, and we want to name the dataset. So I'm going to call it as ds_cases_deaths_raw_csv.http. You may have noticed that I've given HTTP as a suffix for this dataset, because we got another CSV file for the tar sync as well, where I'll call that a data lake. So pick the link service, so that is this one, the one we created just now. And then now this is what I was talking about previously, we want to give the relative URL. So if I bring it over here, okay, so our link service will access up to that point, and we want the dataset to access the rest of the information. So we are going to give that as a relative URL, and I'll put that away. And as we know, our first row is a header, so let's click on that, and we don't need to import any schema because we are not doing any mappings at the moment. So click None and then click on OK. So now that dataset's created as well, so we want to create the sync dataset now, and the sync dataset would be on a data lake, as you know. So click on Datasets on the 3 dots, click New Dataset, and now we want to create the Data Lake Gen 2 dataset. So choose as Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, there's a Gen 1 as well, so be careful what you're choosing and click Continue. Again, we want the CSV file, click Continue and give a name for that one. So I've called the same except for the suffix, which is DL on in this case, and picked the link service, so we created it as part of the last module, which is LS, ADLs, COVID reporting DL, and now we want to give the path for these things. So let's select that, so we know actually we got a container called raw, but under that we wanted to create ECDC as the folder, and then we wanted to create the file name. We'll call that as cases_deaths.csv. And we know this is going to have the first row as the header as well, and again, import schema, click on None and click OK. So that's the dataset created, and the next thing to do is to create our pipeline. So click here, Create New Pipeline, and we want to name our pipeline. I'm going to call that as PL_ingest_cases_deaths_data, and then now we need to start creating our pipeline. So the first thing we want is a copy activity. So you can find the copy activity and then move and transform or search for the copy activity. So bring that over, and now you can leave the rest of the information default. Except for the name we wanted to call our copy activity is copy cases and deaths data, and then click on this source. Now pick your source, which is the HTTP source, and we want to pick the sync, pick the data lake sync, and you can leave the mapping. As we said, we are not doing any mappings and settings and use properties as they are. So we have completed the pipeline. Let's debug this and hope that the file from the URL will get copied across to our data lake. So it's running at the moment. Okay, it took 24 seconds and it's completed, which is great. So let's have a look at the details. So if you click on the spectacles here, you'll see that the HTTP data was 14.316 megabytes and the data lake is 14.316 megabytes as well, so it's copied all the data across. So let's go into the Storage Explorer and see whether the data exists. So let me switch over. Okay, so that's our storage account. So this is our container raw, and we expect to see the ECDC folder and the file inside that as well. Let me refresh. So the folder exists and the file is there as well. Let's download the file into my downloads folder and let's have a look at the data. So if I open it again with Excel, I should be able to see all the data we've seen previously, which is great. It is all there now. So as you can see, we've written a very quick simple pipeline to copy the data from URL into data lake. Before we finish, let's switch back to our data factory and publish the pipelines and the changes we've done. So let me switch back. Okay, and here on the publish all, and there must be 4 changes. So we got the pipeline to datasets and the link service. Click publish and that should publish within a few seconds. So the publishing's now completed. I'll see you in the next session.